All right, this week our course discussion revolves around inmate rights and the access to courts that inmates in state and federal prisons and local jails are constitutionally entitled to. However, this is not a right that has been recognized throughout the course of history, certainly not in this country. Prior to the 1960s, courts were very hands-off in their approach to prison inmates. People believed that prisoners got the treatment that they deserved, and judges believed that prison wardens and those people that administer our prisons and jails knew more about how to handle prison inmates and how to respect the rights of inmates than they did. And so judges had more respect for wardens in those days. And then there was the concept of separation between the executive and judicial branches of the government, whereas the judicial interference in how correctional systems did their jobs was considered crossing that line of separation. And maybe one of the more important reasons was just that prisons were built way out in the boonies in places where people could forget about them. It was an out-of-sight, out-of-mind philosophy. People just didn't care about prison inmates and prison conditions. Again, inmates got what they deserved, was the general opinion of judges and the public. In the 1960s, during the Civil Rights Movement, we see public opinion changing. The rights of the plight of inmates and the conditions of prisons in this country were becoming more and more brought to the public's attention, and judges started to get this idea that if they didn't do something, no one else was going to protect the rights of inmates. And so, along with the Civil Rights Movement, along with caused an equal protection, a due process revolution in the courts affecting inmates. We saw, at the same time, the media highlighting a focus on conditions in prisons, especially after the Attica riots, where on national TV we saw the New York National Guard, at the direction of Governor Nelson Rockefeller, retake the Attica prison, resulting in the death of many inmates and some hostages. We saw a change in attitude by the public towards prisons, especially after Attica, when investigations revealed that the inmates who took over the Attica prison had legitimate complaints. After the 60s and 70s, we saw a great increase in the rights of inmates. The idea was that inmates should retain all the rights of free persons, except those rights required to hold them securely. And so the courts eventually ruled that to infringe upon an inmate's rights must be based on three simple guidelines, and that the burden of proof of meeting this was based on the government. The government had to prove that any violation of an inmate's rights had to be for the maintenance of internal order of the prison, for securing the prison against unauthorized access and escape, and for rehabilitating inmates. And these were the only reasons that were considered acceptable for violating an inmate's constitutional rights. Now, how does if an inmate feels that his rights have been violated, how does he go about having those rights respected? Now, there are three ways an inmate can claim that his rights have been violated. First, through what's known as the writ of habeas corpus. The writ of habeas corpus is basically a legal writ where an inmate basically tells a court, "Hey, judge, I'm being held illegally, and please bring me before you. Please bring me before the court so I can explain why I'm being held illegally, why my rights are being violated." The writ of habeas corpus is built into the main body of the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 9. The Constitution says the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion or public safety require it. In fact, the writ of habeas corpus has only been suspended once in our history. That was during the Civil War by Abraham Lincoln. And it was a very controversial move that was something that Congress and the courts fought against. By the time they were able to force Lincoln into allowing the writ of habeas corpus to come back, the war was over. Three main purposes of the writ of habeas corpus. First is to provide release from illegal confinement. to order a prisoner to come before the court for prosecution, or to order a prisoner before the court to give evidence in some manner. The writ of habeas corpus seeks the release of an inmate from prison, alleging that the inmate is in prison illegally or unconstitutionally. And this is only used after the criminal appeals process has been exhausted. In fact, under current law, as you'll learn as you read through the cases in the textbook, under current law, an inmate cannot file a writ of habeas corpus unless he's exhausted all of the remedies first, and will affect only one person. One of the things about the writ of habeas corpus is it only affects the inmate who files it. Now that is in contrast to a Section 1983 lawsuit, which is based on the United States Code Section 1983, which rather than trying to free the inmate, it seeks improvement in the conditions of confinement or damages, monetary damages from prison officials. Under Section 1983 lawsuit, plaintiffs must establish that the prison or the officer who is sued was acting under the color of law, was acting under his authority, and that the inmate had a constitutional right that was violated. So one of the important things to know about the Section 1983 lawsuit is it only handles violations of constitutional rights, cannot be used for other matters. Usually these will start in federal court, may start as a class action, and will affect all the inmates involved, rather than just a single inmate like it is with the writ of habeas corpus. Now these two methods of getting to the courts have been affected in recent years by a couple of acts of Congress, because after we saw this evolution or this revolution of inmate rights in the 1960s and 70s, the courts were flooded and overloaded with petitions from inmates, and so justice was slowing down. Civil courts were bogged. And so in 1996, we see a couple of pieces of legislation. The first, the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996, which provides that federal habeas corpus relief is only available to state inmates if the inmate has exhausted all other remedies first, including administrative remedies in the prison. In fact, the Supreme Court in some of the cases that you'll read this week have upheld those sections of law that say requiring an inmate to exhaust all administrative remedies is constitutional. It also this Anti-Terrorism Effective Death Penalty Act also contains a 1-year time limit for filing motions to attack the illegality of their sentence. After the year is over, they may no longer file a writ of habeas corpus challenging the legality of their sentence. The other piece of legislation I mentioned is the Prisoner Litigation Reform Act of 1996. It attempted in 3 ways to reduce the number of petitions filed by inmates. First, inmates were required to exhaust all administrative remedies before filing in federal court. Again, this has been upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court as being constitutional. In fact, if even one of the cases that you read this week says that even if the inmate is lazy and doesn't meet a deadline in filling out an administrative remedy within his prison, he misses that deadline, and because he missed it, he's exhausted his administrative. He's out of luck. He can't file in the federal courts. Filing as indigent persons requires payment of filing fees and court costs. And finally, inmates are prohibited from filing as indigent if they had prior petitions dismissed as frivolous. So we're reducing things. The Prison Litigation Reform Act reduces a judge's authority in ordering release of prisoners to reduce overcrowding. Forces judges to find some other way, even though California, this has been happening still. Limits an inmate's opportunity to file civil rights lawsuits. Restricts large-scale intervention of federal judges. If you read Estelle versus Gamble, or some of the other cases dealing with the Texas Youth Commission that we'll look at later in the semester, you'll see large-scale intervention by the courts and the correctional system. And this act effectively cut that down. What's the effect of the Prison Litigation Act? Civil rights petitions declined by 40% as a result. Now, I mentioned there were 3 ways an inmate could access the courts or file complaints about unconstitutional conditions. The third way is through the filing of a writ of mandamus, something that is extremely rare. It's an extraordinary remedy in which the plaintiff has no way to access the courts, and he seeks to compel a government officer to do his job. If a prison warden just absolutely refused to allow the inmate access to the courts, he could file a writ of mandamus, which would force the inmate, force the warden to do his job. Now, the writ of mandamus is also very famous because it was instrumental in the Marbury versus Madison case that developed judicial review in their Supreme Court. What has inmate litigation done over time? It's created a greater understanding of constitutional standards for incarceration. It's increased professionalism of correctional personnel. It increases visibility and accountability of prisons. Makes prisons more bureaucratic, so increased paperwork. Yay. Led to short-term morale problems of prison staff and disruption of prison order. But for the most part, inmate litigation has brought about some good things. And so we'll talk about specific rights for a few minutes. We'll do that in part 2 of this video.